Movie games tend to get a bad rap, whether it's because they're rushed out, they have crappy graphics, a lot of bugs, or poor performance. They just typically aren't ever that great. But in recent years, we've seen a lot of movie franchise games see decent critical and commercial success. Games like Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, or Mad Max, or the Batman Arkham games. While these games all have a similar gameplay style, there is one other key similarity that all of these games share. They're all published by WB Games. The game division over at Warner Brothers has really been knocking it out of the park with a lot of their different franchises. And as the title of this video would suggest, I have a great idea for a new game adaptation that WB could get behind. Alright, I know what you might be thinking. Nick, the Ocean's movies aren't made by Warner Brothers, they're made by Village Roadshow, you doofus. Yeah, but they are distributed by Warner Brothers Pictures. So I'm sure if Warner Brothers Games wanted to make a video game adaptation of Oceans, they would know the right people to talk to secure the rights to make it happen. Anyway, I think a video game adaptation of the Oceans franchise would be really cool and would have the potential to find mainstream success in the games industry. Not only would the franchise have brand recognition, but if the gameplay was handled well, it could draw in even more people, perhaps people who haven't even seen the movies. Not to mention that the franchise is still in the social conscious due to the 2018 release of Ocean's 8. If they're planning on continuing with more films, a game could tie in really well. How would an Ocean's game play? One of the biggest visual traits of the Ocean's films are their style. Interesting scene transitions, framing, superimposed graphics that catch the eye, and really showcase the slick nature that the crew embodies. I think a great game to look at as a base would actually be Hazelight's A Way Out. A Way Out had a very interesting style in the way it presented its story, how it framed the characters and the action, and how players were constantly switching gameplay styles, completing various tasks. It's a game that always has the player doing something different. Joseph Fares was inspired by many Hollywood films when designing A Way Out, and I think his gameplay direction, with a bit more budget and time for polish, would suit an Ocean's game well. Differing from the films, I think a great direction for an Ocean's game to go is giving the player a bunch of choice. One of the core tenets of the franchise is planning the perfect job, and by giving the player the ability to plan a perfect score would be a fun way of allowing people to participate in that part of the process. Usually the audience is left in the dark when it comes to the actual planning of the heists, so that you're surprised later on when you see something that you weren't initially clued into from the start. So by giving the player the ability to choose how they want to tackle a specific job would be an interesting perspective that only the game adaptation would have. For this, I look towards Grand Theft Auto 5, which allowed players to choose between different strategies when pulling off the major heists in the game. This would be a great system for an Ocean's game to adopt. Perhaps if a job required fewer members of the crew, the player could choose which characters they would like to bring along on a specific job. The characters could have different abilities that are unique to just them, so you'd need to plan and strategize on who would be the best person for any specific job, a la Monaco, what's yours is mine. The writing is another very important aspect of the Oceans franchise. The characters are likable and quirky, they all meld together and interact with each other in surprising and entertaining ways. This means that the writing in an Oceans game would be just as important. The writing for each of the crew members would need to keep the fun, free-flowing banter. Whether the original cast would reprise their roles, which I doubt would happen, or if there would be a new Danny Ocean and crew, the writing should still reflect that iconic style. And going a step further, combining choice and writing, I think it would be cool to have separate dialogue options. For example, perhaps you're disguised as a hotel receptionist for a job, and your boss approaches you and isn't aware of your new hire. It would be fun to have a number of dialogue choices to try and convince him that nothing is out of the ordinary. It just opens up the possibilities for replaying missions in new and different ways. Speaking of the missions, I think it would be cool to also borrow from another successful heist game franchise, Payday. In Payday, different elements in each of the game's heists will change every time you play. That means anything from the positions of guards and cameras to the physical locations of rooms within a building can change every single time you play, making the missions continually feel fresh. If this sort of design mechanic were put in place with the in-game missions, paired with the ability to strategize on how to best pull off a job, and with the added choices to be made in dialogue, I think that this Oceans game could really be something special if handled correctly. That said, I am no game designer. I don't know how hard a game like this would be to pull off. Probably pretty hard, but it's fun to dream. The story could go in a number of ways. They could either go earlier in the timeline with a young Danny Ocean, they could go further in the timeline with older versions of the famous characters. Perhaps you could create a character and you're the newbie that has to prove yourself to the group. Maybe there is a rival criminal group that seems to always show up every time a job is being pulled, or maybe even the FBI is finally cracking down and closing in on the group. It could go any number of ways and still be a pretty interesting direction for a video game adaptation. There's lots of ground that the Oceans franchise could explore that haven't been shown in films. And what about post-launch content? All those publishers at WB need to prolong the game and get extra content out somehow. Well, I'm not sure how extensive they would want to go, but I think it would be really cool if the developers would create an expansion that utilized the original film from 1960, starring Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. It could have those versions of the characters, it could be set in the 50s and 60s time period, and pulling off the original Ocean's 11 job. Not only would it be aesthetically cool and interesting, but it could serve to inform people about the original film if they never knew it existed. As for who would develop the game, I have no idea. If Hazelight were a larger studio with more resources, I think they could be a good fit. This game is more of an amalgamation of different mechanics from a number of different studios, so it's hard to suggest any one team that would be fit to bring it to life. Either way, I think the Oceans franchise would benefit from a strong video game adaptation, and if any developers are watching this, you're welcome for the 10 out of 10 ideas. Thanks for watching. Do you think an Oceans video game adaptation would be cool? Who would you want to see develop the game? Put your comments down below. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribing. See you in the next one.